Um, the Rosetta Stone at a conference like this probably needs very little introduction. It was discovered in 1799 and was the first ever monument that displayed Egyptian hieroglyphs alongside a known language. And it was a 2-for-1 offer because it gave demotic as well. And it immediately raised hopes of gaining traction on deciphering ancient Egyptian writing, especially hieroglyphs. It consisted of 14 lines of hieroglyphs, which were mostly incomplete, 32 lines of demotic, which were mostly complete, and 54 lines of Greek, also mostly complete. There was some initial success with the demotic, mostly thanks to Johann David Åkerblad, who was a Swedish diplomat and Orientalist, published in his 1802 letter to Sylvester Sacy, who himself had also published some results earlier that year, which were not particularly overwhelming. The field then stalled and didn't regain momentum until around 1815, when Thomas Young and then Jean-François Champollion entered the fray with a much larger set of materials at their disposition, and then made the crucial breakthroughs in the decipherments of demotic and hieroglyphs. So one question I want to ask in this talk was this, almost 15-year hiatus necessary? And the answer depends to a certain extent on the field's estimation of Åkerblad himself. And I think as a field, we have done a remarkably poor job of appreciating him. Dominant narratives of the decipherment of Egyptian writing pander to charisma. That's to say, they go for hieroglyphs, which are clear and iconic and suggestive of meaning, over squiggly, indistinct demotic. And they also cleave very often to the romantic ideal of the lone genius. And both of these factors favor narratives in which Champollion's the sole focus. And, in all fairness, he does deserve substantial attention. He shouldn't monopolize it as he often does. When corrections to this monofocused narrative emerged, it's usually framed in terms of the Anglo-French rivalry between Young and Champollion. And this is very much exaggerated. It's true that the rivalry was carried on by their countrymen, but this was long after the two of them had actually healed it and in fact had died. 60 years later, there were still people thrashing it out. And though Åkerblad did receive many accolades following his 1802 publication, his neglect also began at that time and was rooted in the attitudes of the gatekeepers of the institutions of Orientalism. So my aim today is to argue that this hiatus in research in progress was not necessary. The methods that Åkerblad used on the demotic of the Rosetta Stone were readily applicable to its hieroglyphs. They could never, of course, have led to a full decipherment, but they could have advanced by several years key findings. And they could also have shaped hypotheses that were ambient when Young and Champollion joined the fray, and that could substantially have changed the history of decipherment. The second point I want to make is that decipherments aren't done or dusted affairs that we move on from once we understand the script. The power of decipherers' simple tools points to their deserving a significant place in the emerging philographic enterprise, which seeks to study linguistic cognition as it's embodied in writing systems. More on that later. So I'm going to begin going over what Åkerblad did, and then I'll talk about what he could have done. The cornerstone of decipherments is, sorry, move this thing so I can see better. Sorry, Yanis, I just realized, what time did we start? Could you remind me?
You started at, well, nominally at 11:05, but we have 8 to 10 minutes of delay.
Okay, so I should aim to finish, say, at 11:28 to 30 for question time. Okay. The cornerstone of decipherment stems from an observation of Leibniz's, which has been rediscovered many times, which is that you look for a dual text with names in it, and then use the names as a fixed point, as an island of stability. And by the time Åkerblad came to the Rosetta Stone, this had been successfully carried out for at least 4 different scripts. Åkerblad's procedure was, in 5, first to find repeated proper names and then use the ratio of lengths of the Greek text to the Demotic in order to find their likely position. So that would give you names like Ptolemy. Then using these names as anchors, you look for other names that appear maybe only once. So Berenice would be an example of that. And from these names, you then distill an alphabet of, which we'll see on the next page. And once you have your alphabet, you then start looking for other legible words in identifiable contexts. And one that I really like is the word for taxes, which is a Greek loan word, which I assume is meant to emphasize their foreignness and alienness in the context of the text. So Åkerblad did that, and his results were on 2 levels. Some concerned decipherment and some concerned the understanding of the text. In terms of decipherment, he produced his initial alphabet. He corrected several of de Sassy's errors. For instance, that the rather extraordinary claim that Alexander was written with 4 capital letters. Instead, de Sassy saw them as stacks of individual letters. He managed to escape Leibniz's tether to some extent, the word taxes being an obvious example, but also figuring out what the Egyptians called themselves and what they called the Greeks, which were not straight transliterations of the corresponding Greek terms. And then probably most importantly of all, he, I think for the first time, offered proof that Coptic really was, as he put it, the remnants of ancient Egyptian that must aid in interpreting not just this inscription, but future ones. So he found words that he knew from Coptic. He was a very advanced Coptic scholar and was able to read them in the Demotic as well. And then the last nice little factoid is that for the letters of Coptic that do not have obvious counterparts in Greek, he was able to trace them to letters in Demotic, which de Sassy had done only for 1 character, I think. So you can see here is sh, and you can see a corresponding squiggle in the Greek. Here is ch, in the Demotic, and you can see a corresponding squiggle in the Demotic. So he produced a pretty substantial set of results, and these extended the text as well. He was able to argue on various grounds that the Demotic was a translation of the Greek and not the reverse, which I think is a pretty impressive result. He used his Demotic to correct the Greek copy that the Institut de France had created. For instance, Aetos, son of Aetos, had been misread as Aetos indeed, wiping out 1 generation of Aetos, of those people who Åkerblad was able to reinstate. And probably most ambitiously of all, he used his Demotic to reconstruct part of the missing Greek. And then he justified his infill by referring to the hieroglyphs. So the infill was 1st, 2nd, and 3rd rank temples and something about a statue of the king. And the supporting hieroglyphs were a squiggle with what obviously looked like 1, 2, and 3 underneath them. So you can see he was quite ambitious in how far he was willing to push beyond mere decipherment of the script. And in that context, I think it makes sense to ask what he might have done next. Well, before we ask that, we have to ask what he actually did do next. Just very briefly, de Sassy responded in a very dampening way. And the effect was that Åkerblad felt no further inclination to continue. He didn't think that anyone would have been interested after one of the most learned men in France basically disagreed with him. De Sassy didn't merely disagree with him, he was obstructionist. So there was a race going on at this time to produce a study of Coptic place names. And there were 3 people in the running, and de Sassy received Åkerblad's manuscript and mysteriously misplaced it, and only eventually published it in 1834, by which time Åkerblad had been dead for 15 years. Åkerblad says in his letter, "I have had time to examine, but most likely, the hieroglyphic part of the inscription." So let's now consider what would have happened if he had more time and more encouragement and more support from the institutions and people at the time. The obvious starting point in the Rosetta Stone hieroglyphs are the cartouches. They clearly highlight things, and they'd attracted attention of researchers in the past as well. Not on this text, obviously, on other texts. The hieroglyphs contain two cartouches, a long one and a short one. And as you can see from this layout, the short one is the initial segment of the long one. The long one occurs 3 times, basically at the end, and then distances x and 3x from the end. And then after the first of those, the one most distant from the end, you get 2 occurrences of the short one. I'll be talking about the start and the middle of lines. The direction of reading was known from, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Zuga, examination of things, but also Åkerblad himself could have deduced it from the order of first, second, and third. This is clearly right to left reading. The hypothesis had been around for a while that names or sacred formulae was what was contained in cartouches, so 1797, but also 1752. But even without this, Åkerblad's starting point had been Ptolemy. This was Ptolemy's monument. I think that's the obvious place to start looking. So then the plausible reading for the cartouches would be, Ptolemy plus some epithets, and possibly just Ptolemy, or Ptolemy plus fewer epithets for the 2 cartouches. This idea would be very easy to confirm by using the ratios that had already been used in the demotic. So as said, this long cartouche occurs at distances at the end and at x and 3x distance away. If you look for some expression of Ptolemy, you find that there is 1 plus some repeated expression at distances at 10 lines and 3 and a bit lines from the end. So in other words, x and 3x again. And just after the long one, you get 2 short ones of just Ptolemy. So you get the long, short, short pattern that you get with in the demotic that you also get with these cartouches in the hieroglyphs. And then the lengths of the number of characters involved in this and also in this and in the Greek are approximately equal. So both the length of the names and their positions in the text is highly suggestive of the reading. There is a problem. I don't have a huge amount of time. There's a problem in that at the end, you don't get the expected cartouche. However, what you get instead is what is clearly the word for king, given its distribution. And so what you've got here then is not Ptolemy plus epithets, it's king plus epithets. And you find other places where the same substitution takes place. The question now is which epithets? If you compare the demotic with the hieroglyphs, you can see where Ptolemy ends, and then there is a clear, I don't know what you want to call it, homology, homomorphism between these characters in the hieroglyphs and the characters here in the demotic. You can see the sweep of the serpent, and you can see the crook of the ang. And then, well, that's a bit harder to draw up, but there's at least evidence to go on. The idea that hieroglyphs and the cursive scripts were in some kind of correspondence had again been around for 50 years by this stage, thanks to work by Barthélemy reported by Kellus. So it looks like what we have here is Ptolemy plus epithet X, and what we have therefore in the hieroglyphs is Ptolemy, epithet X, epithet Y. So the options are Ptolemy, the ever-living, beloved of Ptah, the god manifest, or perhaps just Ptolemy, living, manifest, various options like that. So it looks like, therefore, X must be the ever-living, and Y, the thing here, must be beloved of Ptah, or the god manifest, or the 2 of them together. So wow, time is racing away. Supporting evidence from Harapalo says we're probably looking at beloved of Ptah. The crucial point is then what what would have been the fact that Ptolemy and beloved Ptah begin and nearly end in the same characters. Now, in English, that's kind of obvious because we transcribe them both with PT. In the Greek, it's not obvious because you've got PT and F theta, phi theta. However, in his examination of the Coptic, we find that Åkerblad was very happy to alternate between T and theta and between pi and phi, well, P and F. He regarded them as variants, contextual variants. And de Sacy said this is one of the happiest ideas that you could employ. So in that case, I think it's plausible that he would have seen the PT of Ptah and of Ptolemy and the F theta of Ptah as representing the same sounds in Egyptian, corresponding to the same sounds in Egyptian. He also addressed the issues of why they would have this long phrase in Greek when the corresponding Egyptian would be short, and why the word order would be different between the two of them. That in the Egyptian, it was Ptah beloved, not beloved of Ptah. And then, so in other words, he could easily have concluded from this evidence that these hieroglyphs in red represented the initial sounds of Ptah's name. And then equally, if he was reading these as Mai, as he has over here, and then he could have thought that this was some kind of Y-like sound shared both by Ptah and Ptolemaios, so for the same sound in both of them. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to have to skip over the plausibility. Am I putting too much into Åkerblad's mouth is the basic question. I think the answer is no. Unlike other researchers who also failed to make these associations, they failed for other reasons. Åkerblad would have had much less evidence to look at, so would likely have concentrated on these facts, and he had a very phonographic mindset, unlike Young and Champollion initially. So just before in order to conclude, I want to consider what the impact on understanding of these results would have been. First, he would have confirmed the hypothesis, tenuous arguments previously, that cartouches contain names. Secondly, he would have shown that foreign names were likely written phonetically. Thirdly, he would have shown that native Egyptian names, like Ptah, were also written phonetically, something that would mark Champollion's decisive break away from Young. And then it's possible that he would also have regarded Mai, beloved, as being written partially phonetically as well, which again was a result that didn't emerge until 1824, so 20 years later. So the conclusions, one, we need to be careful about the institutions we build. Åkerblad was clearly excluded for illegitimate reasons. Two, similar methods are reused time and again in decipherment, whether deliberately or by accident. And understanding and appreciating the power of these methods is important for two reasons. One, both for its own sake, and well, I wrote this phrase late last night. You know, there are people who make completely spurious claims about having deciphered the Voynich manuscript, the Phaistos disc, or the Rosetta Stone has recently been argued to be a Slavic language. You know, we need to keep actual results foregrounded in our minds in order to argue, well, in order not to be misled by rubbish like that. But more generally, decipherment is really the bedrock of philography. You know, a key philographic finding is that the highly convergent evolution of independent writing systems developed for highly disparate languages. And this looks mysterious if we think of writing systems as the products of specific peoples, languages, cultures, and material resources. But the convergence is expected if we view all writing systems as the product of a single shared object, namely the human mind. And a proper appreciation of the power of the decipherer's rather Spartan toolkit provides important insight into the mental forces that mold writing and constitutes its own legitimate pathway to insight into the capacity for human language. That is where I will stop. There is a question. That's from Jens.
Thank you. Any questions? Any questions online? No? Okay. So thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you.
Questions?